Buonasera a tutti. È un piacere vedervi così numerosi a questo ennesimo appuntamento della serie delle conferenze del Museo Egizio e è un piacere anche vedere tanti amici dell'ACME e saluto naturalmente anche coloro che si sono collegati online per seguire questa conferenza che ho il piacere appunto di presentare. Come ormai d'ordinanza adesso passerò all'inglese. Per fortuna vedo che in sala adesso disponiamo anche di mezzi che permettono a tutti di accedere anche alle conferenze in lingua, per cui faccio questo passaggio con meno dolore, insomma, per tutti voi. So, good evening and welcome to the Museo Egizio lecture series. It is a great pleasure to introduce this evening speaker, Dimitri Laboury, that is Professor of Art History and Archaeology of Ancient Egypt at the University of Liège. And by the way, it's one of the leading scholars in the study of painters' practice and their role in society in ancient Egypt. The topic of his lecture, entitled "Who Were the 18th-dynasty Painters of Theban Tombs?" confront us with an interesting problem that is not only historical, Egyptological, but also, let me say, epistemological. Having a lot of data for a specific historical period may invite one to use the data to describe contiguous periods that are less well documented. That is, for instance, the case for at Deir, el-Medina, where the figurative and material documentation for the 18th dynasty is smaller than for the later Ramesside period, which does tend to be used as a reference to describe the New Kingdom history of that region. So Dimitri challenged this phenomenon by bringing us the contribution of art history to this problem. And so thank you, Dimitri, to be again here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Grazie mille, Enrico. I would like first to apologize that I'm not capable of giving you this lecture in Italian. This will be my only slide in Italian. I apologize for this, but I would like to say that it's really a great pleasure and a privilege to be here to give this lecture in this wonderful series and this wonderful venue of the Museo Egizio. It's always a pleasure for an art historian to come back to Italy because it's a country for arts, and especially for ancient Egyptian art here in the Piedmont and in Turin. So I'm really delighted to be here in an institution so much devoted, as the promotion, as the advertisement here on the screen recalls, devoted to the promotion of Storia, Arte and Archeologia, and I would like to tell you a little bit about Storia dell'arte this evening. As you probably all know, among the numerous treasures of the Museo Egizio, there are of course important witnesses of the famous Theban tomb paintings of the New Kingdom, which is part of the UNESCO World list, heritage list, and very famous from an artistical point of view. And thanks to Ernesto Schiaparelli, the Museo Egizio is nowadays world famous for its exceptional collection of artifacts from the site of el-Medina. So it seems to me interesting, or relevant, I hope, in this context to address the important issue of the relation between the crew which was settled in the el-Medina and the paintings, the very making of the paintings of the nearby Theban necropolis. Indeed, because of the contiguity of the two sites, it has often seemed natural to assume that the el-Medina and the Theban elite necropolis were closely connected on a functional level. As you can see here, they are just near one another. In red, you have the el-Medina site, and the blue is the elite Theban necropolis just around it in a way. The inhabitants of the village have usually been presented as, I quote here John Römer, the only identifiable group of tomb makers in Western Thebes during the New Kingdom. And as such, They were often and easily considered as plausible candidates for the creation and the decoration of the famous elite Theban tombs and their funerary monuments. Almost 3 decades ago, John Roemer aimed at addressing the issue from a statistical point of view, so to make it more scientific, and his attempt to evaluate and correlate the production rate in the Valley of the Kings, that is the work carried out by the del-Medina crew on the one hand, and on the other hand, in the nearby elite cemetery on the eastern slope of the very same Theban rock formation, led him to a more nuanced suggestion. Here it is. So he suggested that there was a link between the production rates of both, and suggested that they were run by the same administration, which must be sought on the western bank of the Nile River in Thebes. Without discussing the rather problematic question of the estimation or quantification of tomb production rates, even John Roemer was aware of this, and consequently of the conclusiveness of this supposed correlation, the so-called equivalence of effort, as he called it, does not offer any proof at all of, first, the private workforce was a permanent entity situated on the West Bank, and second, that this permanent workforce would have been directed by the same authority that oversaw the del-Medina workmen. See, for instance, that there is a strong divorce here in the 13th century BCE, so it's more or less the reign of Ramses II, by the way. Furthermore, many other historical factors could, of course, have influenced and thus account for this apparent similar production rate in both cemeteries. As you can see here, there are many factors who could intervene in the procedure. But more importantly, there's a methodological and documentary problem which we are now much more aware of than in the time when John Roemer contributed to the topic. That is the evolution of del-Medina and its community through the half of a millennium of its existence. It is indeed increasingly better acknowledged and considered that Egyptology long used to extrapolate the life of this crew over 5 centuries, mainly thanks to the exceptional richness of textual sources from the very last 100 years or so of its history. So just 1/5, and then we extrapolate for the rest. And in this perspective, recent research on literacy practices, and especially the study of literature production and consumption in the village, showed that there's a dramatic change between the pre-Ramesside and the Ramesside period. And this has been shown, for example, with the production of textual consumption in the early Ramesside period by Bernard Mathieu, or also, on the other hand, by the use of pseudo-scripts, the so-called phoenicides. Some are illustrated here in the galleries, which have been brilliantly studied by Ben Haring and his team at the University of Leiden. Those two facts clearly demonstrate a dramatic evolution of the socio-educational level of the population housed in the settlement during the New Kingdom. Besides, Andreas Dorn convincingly suggested that the site might not have been in use on a permanent basis in its early history, and especially in the 18th dynasty before the reign of Amenhotep III. All this renders even more challenging the question of who made the private tomb of Thebes, especially during the 18th dynasty, which is my focus in my own research. And what could have been the involvement of the el-Medina crew in this process. In order to address this double issue, let's start by reassessing the foundations of the commonly assumed hypothesis of el-Medina as the most plausible origin for the artists and craftsmen responsible for the making and decoration of Theban private tombs, with a focus on the 18th dynasty, as I promised. As is well known, the members of the el-Medina community often use their own talents, skills, and resources to create their funerary equipment, including tombs, for themselves as well as for their colleagues within the village. This is normal, this is contribution between colleagues and friends. A good example of these informal workshop practices, as Karakuni suggested to call them, is provided by the Theban tomb, which I will call now TT 359, in the name of the 20th dynasty superior of the crew, Hinherkawi, who commissioned two of the best painters of his team, the two brothers Nebnefer and Horimin, to decorate his funerary monument. Of course, such a case of internal employment, that is when an artist works for himself, for a colleague, for a superior, cannot be considered as evidence for the participation of the el-Medina workforce in the production of private tombs, and in the sense of the elite private tomb I referred to earlier. And the same holds true for artists' funerary chapels, such as the 18th dynasty mutualized tombs of Jehutimos and Kenamun in Saqqara, where you have two artists who mutualize the resources to produce a single tomb for both of the two families. And those two families, it has been proposed, suggested that there might have been some connection with the el-Medina community, but it's really still unclear nowadays. And there are plenty of examples of that kind. So another example is the tomb of Nebamun and Ipuki at El Khoja. It's another part of the Theban necropolis, made by two artists who gathered together to create a shared tomb. And it's the same also to get back, to loop the loop, to get back to, this is Nebamun and Ipuki, sorry, and to get back to the el-Medina with the tomb of Nu and Nachmin. I will refer to this tomb later on, TT 291. As a matter of fact, the only elite private tombs that might be related to the activity of the el-Medina artists and craftsmen are all of Ramesside times, with two dubious cases, as you're going to see, in the 19th dynasty, and two much clearer ones from the late 20th dynasty. So let's have a look at the evidence in this respect. The first case is TT 32, as you can see on the screen. In the sloping passage leading to the burial chamber of this tomb, TT 32, made for the overseer of the granaries of Amun Jehutimos during the reign of Ramses II, 3 control marks were signed by the painter, Zeshked in ancient Egyptian, Pai. These signatures prompted the editor of this monument, our colleague Zoltán Fabian, to suggest that this painter most probably supervised the tunneling operation, maybe also the entire architecture in the tomb, and could be moreover identified with a contemporary namesake attested as a member of the el-Medina community, a certain Pai, which is pinpointed, by the way, in the vitrines of the Museo Egizio up here. But Pai at that time was a rather common name, and other painters' Pai are attested in the early Ramesside period, including outside the el-Medina, weakening what must remain a mere hypothesis. So it's a hypothesis not because you have one Federico, that it's all attestation of Federico is the same, of course. Blink of the eye. The second case in the Bubasteion cliff, it's the contemporaneous royal steward and ambassador of Ramses II, whose name was Necherimos and had a nickname Parichnawa or Parichnu in Hittite sources. This guy had his tomb, so he was some sort of a minister of foreign office at the time of Ramses II. He had his tomb made in the so-called cliff of the Bubasteion in Saqqara, with a protruding, as you can see on the right side of the screen, a protruding high-relief depiction of Hathor as a cow coming out of the rock from the rear wall of the tomb and protecting a royal figure in adoration. The editor of this monument, Alain Pierre Zivy, the French scholar Alain Pierre Zivy, who discovered the tomb, compared this rock-cut statue with an almost equivalent two-dimensional representation of the goddess preceded by an effigy of a prince labeled, so this is what you have on the left-hand side of the screen, and this effigy of the prince is labeled with the epithet Parechnu, so there's a connection, of course, with the nickname of our Nechery Mose, on the stela of the co-listener of the place of Maat, so a member of the el-Medina crew, whose name is Chabechnet, and the stela you have on the screen is now kept in the British Museum. And since the tomb of this el-Medina crew member, TT2, features a similar depiction of Hathor as a cow emerging from the cliff, as well as the one of his colleague, the sculptor Ken, in TT4, Zivi inferred that those two artists of the el-Medina were responsible for the decoration of the tomb of Necho'ri Mose. This is indeed an appealing speculation, but yes, it's an insufficiently conclusive speculation. It's just a hypothesis. It's appealing, it's attractive, but it's not demonstrable. The two cases of the late 20th dynasty are, as you're going to see, definitely more undisputable. They both relate to the same individual, the chief painter of the el-Medina, Amenhotep, son of Amunnakhte, which is another top painter. Actually, he was a painter and became a scribe, who was also pinpointed in the galleries of the museum, Amunnakhte. So those two cases relate to Amenhotep's son of this famous Amunnakhte. And this Amenhotep was a highly educated artist who was very well known and who was plainly a star of his time, like a Leonardo of his time, I could say here in Italy, and happened to decorate at least two Theban elite tombs, TT65 and TT113, as can be demonstrated on signature as well as stylistic evidence. Let's start with TT113, which we have on the screen. The tomb is in very bad condition nowadays. It was made in the name of the web priest and Heri Sesheta, so superior of the secrets of the estate of Amun, Kinebu. So this man was a lower middle ranking official and priest. And this tomb was visited in the early 19th century by John J. Wilkinson and Robert Hay, who are the more or less founding father of Egyptological tradition in United Kingdom. And Wilkinson recorded a funeral scene with a self-portrait in assistenza. This is Italian, so it's when an artist introduces himself into his own composition. And you have here in the red rectangle our painter who depicted himself reading the ritual of the opening of the mouth and designated himself as the scribe and deputy of the venerable institution of the tomb, which is the name of the el-Medina institution, Amenhotep. The few preserved remains of the decoration compare favorably with the quite well characterized style of Amenhotep, which is, as I just said, quite well known. So it fits very well. The other case, TT65, is actually a Thutmose tomb of the time of Hatshepsut, which was observed by the chief of the altar chamber and the chief of the temple archives of Amun, Imiseba, who was a top scholar of his time of the late 20th dynasty. This tomb is referred to, so this is Imiseba on the right and Amenhotep on the left, and this tomb is referred to in a graffito left in year 9 of Ramses IX in the tomb of Ramses VI in the Valley of the Kings, KV 9, stating that the scribe Amenhotep and his son, the scribe and deputy of the painters Amennakhte, so it's a tradition in ancient Egypt to give the name of your father to your son. So Amenhotep and his son Amennakhte of the tomb came there after they executed the decoration in the tomb of the overseer of the scribes of the temple, Imiseba, of the estate of Amun. So we have a signature or a textual evidence for the connection with the painter and the painted tomb. And the late Candy Keller and Thomas Bach has perfectly shown that the stylistic analysis of the decoration of TT65 not only allows the specific painterly handwriting, or I should say hand painting, of the two father and son artists to be recognized, but also leads to the conclusion that they were helped in their task by a friend and contemporary of Amenhotep, Horimin, to whom I referred earlier, whose individual style is has also been treated very well by Keller in details. So these two isolated cases, so we have to forget about the 19th dynasty cases and we have to focus on the two 20th dynasty cases, those two cases are nevertheless very specific in the sense that first, they belong to a rather special period of ancient Egyptian history, Thomas Bach describes it as a period of extreme civic violence, inter-elite skirmishing, various bloody wars, and patronage from the Ramsesnacht family and the Hilk, and locally all-powerful Amun clergy. So it's a very specific period of ancient Egyptian history. And it's also a period during which the Theban artistic talents were clearly to be found on the West Bank and not anymore on the East Bank, that is in the el-Medina, and not anymore in the estate of Karnak. Furthermore, these two cases are also highly specific because they involve a close and limited social network. I'm not going to talk about Facebook or whatever, but social network have always existed, as you can imagine, of course, since humanity existed. And we know that both Kinebu and Imiseba, they are documented to have a business contact with the el-Medina community. So this is the case for Kinebu. We have this ostracan, which refers to the fact that he commissioned some object to be made in the el-Medina community, and it's the same for Imiseba. So they were closely connected with the crew of the el-Medina. So it's a very narrow social network, and it's a very, very special case. So, in any case, those two private works of the distinguished Amenhotep, son of Amun-Nacht, in the Theban elite necropolis cannot substantiate a general theory of a regular implication of the el-Medina crew in the making of such tombs, a theory for which the evidence is actually very scarce, to say the least, and to be kind. If the chief painter Amenhotep, son of Amun-Nacht, was plainly a kind of artist Renaissance would have, or Rinascimento, I should say, would have designated as Pictor Doctus, that is a scholar painter like Raphael or Michelangelo, accumulating prestigious responsibilities and religious titles and capable of creating new compositions, both in images and text, for his royal as well as private clientele. Such was certainly not the case for most, if not all, of his pre-Ramesside colleagues in the village or the community of the el-Medina, as I'm going to show. As mentioned earlier, the dearth of textual production in and around the settlement during the 18th dynasty and the use of parascriptural system of notation, the pseudo-script called phonicide, strongly hint in this direction, but there are more and not exclusively philological arguments to support such a deduction. That is, the tombs of the artists at issue, or in other words, they own work for themselves. They left this to us. First of all, among the 18th dynasty tomb that can be related to the coeval community of the el-Medina, a strikingly small amount of them were decorated, in clear contrast with the Ramesside situation of the village and its necropolis. Out of a total of about 300 burials datable to the 18th dynasty in both western and eastern cemetery of the el-Medina, only 6 or 7 of them that is less than 3% of the tombs were discovered with a decorated chapel. In addition to this raw archaeological fact that might be due at least partly to socio-economic factors, and more revealingly, almost all of these funerary monuments, as you're going to see, were decorated in a quite rudimentary way, which needs to be further analyzed here. So let's have a look at them. Let's go to the el-Medina. The earliest preserved one of those tombs, the unfinished tomb TT 340, was made for the cold listener, that's his title, Amenemhat, apparently thanks to his son Sennefer, who depicted himself, again it's a self-portrait in assistenza, in the tomb as someone who writes correctly and causes his name, that is the name of his father, to live. You have them on the screen. Let's have a look at this tomb. So this is the decoration, and this funerary chapel is of really tiny dimensions. I've already been in it. It's not possible for me to stand. I'm too tall, or the tomb is too small for me. Its only room measures 1.59 centimeters long, 2.20 meters large, and only 164 meters high, so that it's not possible to stand in it, as emphasized by Nadine Cherpion, who published the monument. You can see here the scale on the screen. Even more significantly, I think, from my art historical point of view, the iconographic scheme and repertoire are particularly basic, strongly reminiscent of the usual decoration of funerary stelae of the time, with the adoration and presentation of the offerings to Osiris and Anubis in a symmetric composition, or the deceased couple sitting in front of an offering table with family members aligned in rows. This is the basic elements of funerary decoration since the beginning of the Old Kingdom, I would say. The side walls with the upper part, rounded by the vaulted ceiling of the chamber, also display the typical stela motif of the pair of wedged eyes on both sides of an incense spot on top of the three water lines for Mu, which is also typical of the decoration of stela. And the inscriptions are equally telling, as you're going to see. Those inscriptions on the walls indeed confirm the impression of a decoration directly inspired, if not derived, from the visual culture of basic, or I would say low-cost funerary monuments such as stelae. Through a careful analysis of this short text, the late Jean-Marie Cruchten was able to demonstrate that Senefer, the alleged and self-proclaimed son who writes correctly, clumsily reproduced formulae learned by rote, such as Het Dinizut, the normal funerary formula, which he tried to adapt or amend almost exclusively with uniliteral signs. So this is the alphabetic elements of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, thus making, of course, many errors that betrays his actual and rather low level of literacy. Even in his boastful signature as a self-portrait in assistenza, our obviously self-taught novice scribe Senefer made a lot of orthographic mistakes. Those who can read hieroglyph can see in the transcription on the left. Also it's interesting that he copied some signs that are visually derived from hieratic. So he knows signs as visual codes, but he doesn't know how to write, or he learned how to write and read by himself. Besides, he regularly broke the composition or editorial rules for hieroglyphic panels in monumental decoration. For example, he inverted the orientation of the text and the figure to which they are related, which is a big mistake in Egyptian art, so it has to be fitting in the same direction. He also disregarded the norms of grouping hieroglyphs in balanced quadrat for the Het Dinizut formula here. He rejected final signs out of the panel that was not properly composed in advance, like here and there. You have signs that were not comprised in the panel of inscriptions, and even reversed the order of words or signs for the epithets of Osiris Hekajet. Interestingly enough, Daniel Soliman, in his study of the use of workman's mark in pre-Amarna tombs at el-Medina, observed exactly the same kind of hieroglyphic mistakes on the few inscribed objects from those burials. I don't read, you can read it on the screen. And comparable evidence of a lack of hieroglyphic mastery might also sometimes be detected in the official, though certainly supervised work of the el-Medina crew during the 18th dynasty, that is on the mural on the contemporary tomb of the Valle of the Kings. So this is their work. They were probably supervised by top artists, but nevertheless it's full of mistakes. For instance, in the burial chamber of Amenhotep II, KV 35, the first tomb in the history of the New Kingdom royal tombs, whose decoration in the schematic style of an illustrated ritual papyrus was complemented with large-scale figurative scenes depicting the king in interaction with deities, which you can see on the screen. In one of these scenes, the epithet of the god Anubis was written in 2 columns, so that the determinative or classifiers at the end of the words and suffix pronouns at the end of the word Jew were pushed into the 2nd column, a work break certainly not to be expected from a properly trained scribe who fully comprehends what he writes. So if a student in Egyptology would divide the text like this, he would fail at its exam at the university. This kind of mistake seems to reveal again a rather limited capacity to improvise on the basis of a given textual pattern, probably not entirely understood. So probably they had the signs in front of them, they know how to reproduce them, but they can't read what it means, and so they make mistakes. Interestingly enough, to the contrary, such errors are extremely rare in coeval elite Theban tombs, where an improvisational ability to lay out and adapt the composition according to the surface to be decorated can easily be observed, although it's quite rare. A very good and clear example was provided by the archaeological investigation of TT 79. The clearance of the courtyard of this tomb of the overseer of the double granary of Upper and Lower Egypt, Menkaper Aseneb, a very important person of the Thutmose period. The clearance of the courtyard of this tomb brought to light an ostracon, which you have on the left-hand side, with a sketched inscription in cursive hieroglyphs prepared for a scene, and this scene was luckily preserved in the funerary chapel itself. It's on the right of the screen. Heike Heyer, the editor of the monument, compared the two versions of this short text, that is the initial draft and its final actualization on the wall of the tomb, and she noted only minor deviations. But these deviations provide clear evidence of an excellent mastery of monumental hieroglyphic writing. Indeed, this inscription was re-edited with respect to the space left for it in the depicted scene, that is the size and the distribution of the columns on the wall, without any break inside a single word. And the text was adjusted. So you can see here, anytime you have a red line, it means that he cut between two words, but he never cut inside a word. And anytime you have a polychrome vignette, it means that he changed the orthography or the spelling of a word to adapt it to the composition of the word of the text on the wall. These emendations, obviously made on the spot during the transcription of the sketched model onto the wall, demonstrate that the author of this mural was a scholar painter, expert in the arts and rules of designing ancient Egyptian monumental decoration. Conversely, in TT 340, if Senefer appears as a professional painter who knows how to prepare pigment, how to handle a brush, he clearly tried to go beyond the limitations of his artistic and hieroglyphic training and skills. The quite unorthodox style of his figures, with their wasted limbs and rather stiff shape, is also evidence that he ventured out of what we could call nowadays his usual comfort zone in order to produce this exceptional decorated funerary chapel for his plainly beloved father Amenemhat. So he wanted to pay an homage to his father, but he went out of his comfort zone and made many mistakes that betrays his actual educational level. So it's very interesting for us, of course. The analysis of the second 18th dynasty decorated tomb in el-Medina, TT 354, leads to a very similar conclusion. So again, the chapel is barely larger, it's very small, and its decoration, left even more unfinished, presents the same characteristic. Again, a stele-like composition and repertoire with antithetic depiction of funerary deities and seated couple of deceased receiving offerings, so the basic of funerary decoration. The tomb could not be attributed to a specific individual because its inscriptions are completely absent through the place, though the place to receive the text were in some cases manifestly prepared but left blank. We have some blank panels where the text was supposed to be inscribed, but the men who know how to write never showed up, so it was left like this. As Nadine Cherpion, the editor of the monument, noted, the style is clumsy, careless, and obviously maladroit at every level. The elongated figures with heavy limbs, or the lack of any detail, from the necklaces to the baskets or the offerings, everything points to an insufficiently mastered craftsmanship. The best example of this is perhaps to be observed in the decoration of the ceiling. Whereas the son of Amenemhat in TT 340 opted for the quite simple depiction of a vine rack, with alternatively a grape and a vine leaf in a grid-like framework, the anonymous painter of TT 354 tried to imitate the more sophisticated fabric patterns usually encountered on the ceiling of elite tombs. But he produced an awkwardly irregular and unbalanced composition that reveals his ignorance of the technique to paint such a motif. It's quite simple, but the presence of most probably pedagogic sketches that clarify the structure of such patterns on the wall of unfinished elite tombs or even on ostraca, shows that these elaborate designs were not so common or nor easy to make, but required a training or at least an explanation to which the painter of TT 354 obviously did not have access. So just like Senefren TT 340, in his wish to create an exceptionally decorated funerary chapel within the 18th dynasty cemetery of el-Medina, our painter ventured beyond the limits of his actual artistic abilities, and this is still plainly detectable in his own work. The next tomb is TT8, the tomb of Ra, which is, of course, one of the most important element in the Museo Egizio collections. So this next 18th dynasty decorated tomb chapel in the chronological order, the TT8, is certainly of the same date, but it was made for a superior in the hierarchy of the crew, the chief and director of all the works in the Great Place, this is the name of the institution of the time, the architect Ra, whom you know very well from the collections here in the Museo Egizio. Nowadays, he is famous because of the discovery of his undisturbed burial, his highly unusual undisturbed burial by Ernesto Schiaparelli's expedition in 1906. The painted chapel has, in fact, dimensions very similar to the previous ones, but inverted, that is, with a single room longer than large and a slightly higher ceiling. Its entrance door and general architecture were more monumentalized, and the decoration definitely closer to the contemporary elite standard. You can see this, for example, in the way the painter was able to manage the decoration of the ceiling. The classic themes of the deceased couple adoring funerary deities and receiving offerings were enhanced by subsidiary scenes of quite nicely diversified offering bearers or female musicians clearly derived from the repertoire of nobles' tombs. The rear and focal wall still presents in its stele-like rounded upper part a symmetric composition with two images of the god Anubis as a jackal recumbent on a base representing the Sech motif on both sides of a central papyrus and lotus flower bouquet. But it was designed to be integrated. To be integrated physically as well as iconographically with a real stela, so it's more sophisticated. A formula to be adopted in subsequent chapels in the cemetery and again inspired from elite tombs. The style is also much more reminiscent of tombs of the elite with much better shaped and balanced figures, though often still quite elongated and not entirely devoid of any trends of clumsiness. Transparency effect, as you can see here with the sleeve of the lady just out of the extract I took. Transparency and texture effect in the depiction of the garments or wigs. Finely detailed offerings and pieces of jewelry and much better master painted fabrics patterns on the ceilings, as we have seen. But the inscriptions are nevertheless still flowed by many oddities. In addition to few hieroglyphs presenting an unusual form, like here you have an unusually and surprisingly fat viper, or the Heru sign here, it's not very common, it's not very classic. And this was studied by Jeanne Vendier d'Abadie in her publication, first publication of the tomb, and she noted all those mistakes. Furthermore, some signs were sometimes simply omitted, like the N sign, the sign of the water, in the expression Senetef, his sister, for his wife, introducing the name of merit here in the square in blue. Since Ra was at the highest level of the hierarchy in the el-Medina crew, it is extremely likely that just like Hin-Herkawi did for his own tomb, TT 359, which I referred to earlier in this lecture, a little bit more than 2 centuries later, Ra might have employed the best talents of his team to decorate his own funerary monument. That's more than logical. But those best talents, supposedly top artists within the community, rather well trained in the art of painting, showed clear signs of a limited hieroglyphic literacy or mastery, probably comparable to Ra himself, who apparently did not ask for any correction, though he seems to have claimed to be a royal scribe. But there are mistakes in the inscriptions of his tomb, there are mistakes in the inscriptions of his object. He doesn't seem to have asked for corrections of those mistakes. So again, again, there's a gap with elite tomb makers, and this gap is quite patent. It's not until the end of the 18th dynasty, after the Athenist episode of the reign of Akhenaten, that inscriptions start to appear flawless in the tomb of the el-Medina. The next example, you have it here in Museo Egizio. It's the case of the nearby TT 338, the funerary chapel of another prominent member of the community, the painter of Amun in the place of Ma'at, Maya, who might also have been the chief of the artists of the place of Ma'at, according to Mario Tosi. This small monument, now preserved in the Museo Egizio in Turin, is again of quite tiny dimensions, as you can figure out, because you can see the monument itself. It was beautifully painted in a very well-mastered, directly post-Amarna style, with a more diversified iconographic repertoire, including 2 detailed boat processions, you can see on the screen here, a funeral scene with a lively group of female mourners, or a double depiction of the tomb, and much more space devoted to longer inscriptions written by a practiced and regular hand, with 2 coats of the so-called pyramid text, or what we should designate nowadays as glorification ritual text after Jan Assmann, or the late Jan Assmann. The next and almost last tomb to see is TT 268. It's an anonymous tomb, the first chapel of TT 268. Only the lower part of its wall is still preserved. But the style of the decoration, as well as its iconography, and even the paleography of its remaining text, are strongly reminiscent of the ones probably painted by Maya himself in TT 338. I show you just a comparison. An image is much better than a long discourse, I think. You have another example here from this tomb. And the last one, finally, the unfinished mutualized tomb, TT 291, which I referred to earlier, shared by the 2 co-listeners, Nu and Nachmin, is also to be dated to the very end of the 18th dynasty, just after the Amarna period, it seems. Although its style and iconography are definitely more, let's say, sober, not to say basic, its inscriptions are free from the kinds of mistakes encountered in every pre-Amarna tomb of the village. So, art historical characterization of 18th dynasty decorated tombs in the cemetery of the el-Medina community, taking into account their size, iconographic repertoire and scheme, their style and the quality of workmanship, as well as textual epigraphy, leads to some rather important conclusions, I think, for the question raised in the present lecture. First of all, compared to the non-elite funerary monuments such as the Middle Kingdom chapels in Abydos or the early New Kingdom structure built in the plain just below the slopes of Drabul Naga excavated by Daniel Pauls, they appear absolutely normal, quite average, and even with some tokens of ambitions, certainly due to the specific skills of the members of the crew and their involvement in the monumental production. These artists used and capitalized on an iconographic repertoire directly inspired by the visual culture and basic and or low-cost or affordable funerary monuments such as stelae and their tradition. A visual culture they might have partly derived from their own professional activities, though it was probably shared by almost every ancient Egyptian of the time. Second, however, the production for themselves in this respect, at least during the pre-Amarna period, is still quite far from the specific and more scholarly el-Medina iconographic tradition or culture the successor, were to develop in the Ramesside period. That is, after the re-establishment of the community and its organizational reform under the reign of Horemheb, gradually appropriating and reinterpreting the visual and to some extent also textual culture of the sophisticated royal tombs they built and decorated. So there's a clear contrast between 18th dynasty before Amarna and post-Amarna Ramesside tombs in the el-Medina. Going back to the essential topic of my presentation, the comparison between these funerary monuments made by the el-Medina crew members of the pre-Amarna era with contemporary elite Theban tombs reveals a striking discrepancy, I think, in terms of artistic abilities and autonomy. The decoration of 18th dynasty chapel of the el-Medina is extremely repetitive, and almost any attempt to step beyond the limit of the classic and basic repertoire was marked by quite patent and easily detectable mistakes, as you could see. To the contrary, in coeval elite tombs of the Theban necropolis, the schemes are usually customized to the space to be decorated, and more importantly, to the idiosyncrasies of the professional, historical, and individual profile of the commissioning patrons. Moreover, when they are preserved, sketches for wall decoration always convey a very minimalist information, often focused on the general layout of the composition, as you can see on the ostracon on the left, or the thematic encoding, implying first a rather large range of freedom for the artist to create. They were very free to create. That is important from an art historical point of view, but also a great artistic autonomy they were capable of creating. So on the right-hand side, you have a pictogram that was found by Gabriel Pieke and myself in TT96. We recently published it in a Gedenkschrift publication. And this sign with a man holding a cup to his mouth was the code used to tell the painter, here you will make a banquet scene. So the banquet scene was contracted to this minimalistic information, and with this the painter knew what to do and knew how to make it. So this ability to improvise and to elaborate on a raw, basic given model or theme is precisely the ability that seems to be lacking so much in the artistic profile of the pre-Amarna members of the el-Medina community. These observations compel us to conclude that 18th dynasty artists of el-Medina, though they were professional artists working for the crown, were actually incapable of making the nearby elite Theban tombs. So once again, who made the private tombs of Thebes? Despite what has often been thought and repeated, the el-Medina community was certainly not the only identifiable group of tomb makers in Western Thebes during the New Kingdom. A crucial hint in this respect is provided by the double self-portrait in assistenza of the painter of Amun, Userhat, in TT75, the tomb of his superior in the domain of Amun, the second high priest of Amun, Amenhotep Sisay, and at that time, the second high priest of Amun is in charge of artistic business in the temple of Amun. And we are here under the reign of Thutmose IV. The contextualized analysis of this double self-portrait in assistenza indeed reveals that it functioned as a pictorial signature left by the master painter who decorated this funerary chapel, the guy you have on the screen, Userhat, proving that an artist officially affiliated to the domain of Amun in Karnak, because he's labeled the painter of Amun, and apparently one of the most prominent one of his time, could engage in the making of elite monuments and even be allowed by his private patron to sign his own work. There's another piece of evidence. Indeed, this is corroborated by another famous case of equal importance, the one of Pahiri of El-Kab. This future governor of his own town in Upper Egypt was, in an early stage of his career, a painter of Amun as well. In this capacity, he appears to have decorated the very individualized and now almost completely lost Theban tomb of his colleague and, in all likelihood, his friend, the scribe accountant of grain Wensu, TTA4, whose fragments are now kept in the Louvre. I show you one on the screen. But also, he was the author of the rock-cut tomb of his renowned grandfather, the veteran Ahmos, son of Ibana, in El-Kab, which are the two other images on the back side of the screen. Labeling the most prominent of his many self-depictions in this funerary monument by the son of his daughter, who directed all the works in this tomb, as the one who causes to live the name of the father of his mother. Just in case you have missed the connection with his grandfather, the painter of Amun, Pahiri, justified. So he really stressed this with this very visible and plainly obvious inscription. This other case of private tomb signed by a painter of Amun is of great significance in the perspective developed here, because it provides further evidence of the versatility and wide range of expertise of these top artists, who reveal themselves plainly capable of mastering an iconographic repertoire well beyond the limit of temple imagery, including in another medium than painting, since this tomb that you can see on the screen, the tomb of Ahmos, son of Ibada, was decorated in reliefs, which means that painters were also capable of sculpting relief. And this also demonstrates their mobility, since El-Kab is distant of about 80 kilometers from the Theban area. So he moved 80 kilometers south to do the tomb of his grandfather. The geographic mobility of 18th dynasty artists of the domain of Amun is actually well substantiated. I just quote a few examples. For instance, you have this small stela, stela 4528 of the Manchester Museum, in the name of the sculptor of Amun Anhotep, made by his colleague and probably friend, the web priest of Amun, the chief sculptor Nejem. It was found in 1895 by Flinders Petrie and John Quibble on the site of the Tutmosis temple of Set in Ombos in Nagada. That is a site 35 kilometers north of Thebes, where the two artists from Thebes were probably sent on an artistic mission. Another stela housed in the Louvre, now lost it seems, belonged to the chief sculptor, the Hericai Medjat of Amun, Amenemope, who was also appointed as chief sculptor in the mansion of the pharaoh Hai, the successor of the famous boy king Tutankhamun, in Abydos, so more than 100 kilometers further north. And there are plenty of other examples here. The chief painter of Amun, Deir, heir of 6 generations of artists in the same function, who was commissioned by Seti I to repair Athene's damages in Karnak, but also in the rest of the Theban area as the director of the works, this is his title, and artistic functions of Amun in the Achmenu, the Mensud, the Achsud, the Jizar Aket, the Jizar Jizeru, and the Heneket Angsol temples on the west bank of the Nile of Thebes. Or Dedia, it's my last example, is equivalent, Dedia's equivalent in sculpture, the chief sculptor of the Lord of the Two Lands, Hatiai, who gave birth to divine statues throughout the country, and he's known also as along his colleague and probably friend, the master shipbuilders, Yuna, whose stela is kept in the British Museum. And this seems to have always been the case, because in the provincial tombs of the Old Kingdom, the tomb owner are very proud to refer to the fact that they were capable, they were important enough to drag some top artists from the residence to work in their tombs. And we even have evidence in demotic contracts, or in the late period, of the mobility of those artists. These artistic commissions were in fact part of a much broader and general system developed from the very beginning of pharaonic society, and consisting in raising teams of well-trained experts or workforces. In this case, it's what I would like to call art forces, who could then be dispatched and used all over the country according to the ruler's project. It seems that it was one of the rules that structure ancient Egyptian society. So the king trained some teams of experts, and he could use and move them as long as he wants according to his project. This is suggested by the recent discovery of the papyri of Wadi Jarf, published by Pierre Tallet, who, as you probably know, found by chance the journal of some experts. We could call them transporters, but not from the movie. Transporters who were trained to transport difficult things in the Sinai or the Tura limestone to build the casing blocks, the casing structure of the Pyramid of Cheops in Giza, and they were dispatched here and there according to the needs of the crown. I would also like to remind here that Marc Gabol published in studies in honor of his master Jean-Claude Goyon in 2008 a papyrus, a letter, which suggests an administrative control of the whereabouts of workers and especially of artists in order to move them from one place to another. So it seems that there was a structure, an administrative structure to control all those things. This highly centralized system, which characterizes pharaonic society as a whole, and I would even say Egypt even nowadays, accounts for the fact that whenever an ancient Egyptian artist mentioned his professional affiliation, it was always to the king or his residence, especially in the Old Kingdom, or a temple, particularly in the New Kingdom, which means the same, because temples are dependent on the king. Since it was in those royal institutions that artistic forces could be raised, trained and employed, and above all needed. So to train good artists, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, so you cannot make artists everywhere. You need to have institutions to produce them and train them. For the elite in this system, for the elite and the deliberate use of art as a display of prestige, one of the most important consequences of this institutional monopolization of artistic resources by Pharaoh, the main producer, consumer, and patron of arts, was that skilled, expert, and autonomous artists were to be found in such royal institutions. In this context, and getting back to the elite Theban necropolis under the 18th dynasty, it seems quite clear that the principal source for artistic talents in Upper Egypt during the first part of the New Kingdom was the domain of Amun, based in Karnak, at large. If the estate of Amun was indeed the main origin of the artists who made the private tombs of Thebes in the 18th dynasty, this might allow us to explain some characteristic of this necropolis. One such aspect is the very significant presence of the personnel of the domain of Amun in the necropolis. Its top dignitaries, high priests and great stewards, of course, as expected, but also some lower-ranking officials with a surprising importance of categories such as the scribes, accountants of grains of Amun, as Wolfgang Helck underlined 3 decades ago. A good and well-known example already mentioned above is the very singular tomb of Wensu TTA4, almost certainly designed and decorated by the painter of Amun, Bahiri, with whom he seems to have worked and might have been a friend of. One would expect from a general art historical point of view, personal connection through work environment, including of course relations of subordination or thanks to family ties, appear to have been among the most efficient means to have access to artistic and monumental production in ancient Egypt. Indeed, in general art history, you can have access to artistic resources either because you are rich and powerful or because you know the guys. And this seems to have been the case, of course, in ancient Egypt, like in any other civilization. A similar professional as well as personal connection could justify the very existence of the world-famous exquisite, though very small and unfinished tomb of the horologer priest of Amun, Nacht TT52. You all know this picture, of course. It's very famous and it's possible to demonstrate that it was already famous in ancient time. Despite the fact that our Nacht here belonged to a social professional category that left almost no other archaeological trace, and he was apparently not naturally meant to gain access to monumental deaths, this Nacht managed to own one of the most beautiful and exquisite and valued tombs in the Theban necropolis. The only explanation I can find for this is that he was a very close friend with one of the best masters of his time in the domain of Amun. The same holds true for the other well-known tomb of Nacht, TT161, tomb of a gardener of Amun in the time of Amenhotep III. It's the only tomb of a gardener we know from ancient Egypt, from the entire history of ancient Egypt. Again, it's a one single room tomb, but it seems that in the entire history of ancient Egyptian art, floral bouquets have never been depicted as luxuriant and exuberant as in the single room of this tomb of a floral offering bearer of Amun. And the artist responsible for the magnificent murals of this tomb chapel, plainly a scholar painter, as you're going to see, involved himself in his creation. He developed some varnish techniques and so on, and he wanted to show off that he was a hieroglyphic master, since he invented 4 new hieroglyph compositions to pictorially transcribe the main title of our gardener, to whom he thus seems to have been rather closely connected. So here you have the title of floral offering bearer of Amun, and he reused some already existing hieroglyphs and transposed them to create a floral composition, and he made it at least 4 times in the tomb, with different variations to create new hieroglyphs. So as I used to say with my students, he had his PhD in Egyptology, this painter. If the members of the el-Medina, and I think it's time to conclude, if the members of the el-Medina community could without any possible doubt and increasingly through time be occasionally commissioned to work outside the usual institutional posting, that is in their case the royal necropolis of Thebes, the same was of course true for their colleagues with other administrative affiliations all over Pharaoh's kingdom. Because of this mobility, artists, craftsmen, and workers in general in ancient Egypt, one cannot deduce from the proximity of the el-Medina settlement and the nearby elite Theban necropolis that the latter was the product of the former, no matter how such an inference might seem tantalizing. Quite the contrary, as we have seen, until at least the very end of the 18th dynasty, the inhabitants of the village of the el-Medina demonstrated through their own productions for themselves. This is usually where you make the best out of what you can do. They manifest inability to master the various skills required for the making of an elite tomb of the time. The reason for this is simply that not that they were stupid or bad artists, it's just that they were trained in another specialty for another goal by the central power. This leads us to the very function of such a settlement and crew. Various camps for workers on a royal mission are known from ancient Egypt, such as the one found by Herbert Winlock and his team on the site of Deir al-Bahari, or the huts built by the el-Medina crew itself in the Valley of the Kings at the occasion of the excavation and decoration of specific royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. But the settlement of the el-Medina is of another kind, more durable and organized, made for a long-lasting undertaking. In New Kingdom archaeology, there's only one, to my best knowledge, one equivalent to it, the Amarna workmen's village. They both have in common their situation near the royal cemetery, which was obviously their raison d'être. This is precisely why the community settled in the el-Medina did not, at least originally, have the abilities and training to create private tombs. They were initially skilled and probably put together to produce royal tombs of the type practiced in the early 18th dynasty when the village was founded, but not private tombs. And it was only because of their own socio-educational improvement along with the evolution of their artistic resources available in the Theban area that during the Ramesside period that some of them happened to decorate elite funerary monuments. Otherwise, like in any cemetery in ancient Egypt, it seems such private monuments were produced thanks to the local artistic resources to be found in temples or royal estates, if any, nearby. But the specialization of the crew hosted on the site of the el-Medina, even if they were more or less secluded for security reasons regarding the knowledge about the royal burials, does not necessarily mean that this team of workmen was completely isolated from the administration of the rest of the artistic production in the Theban area, especially in the 18th dynasty. Recent study of the few pieces of evidence relating to the administration of the el-Medina community, recent study undertaken here with material from the Museo Egizio during the Tutmosid period, has indeed confirmed that they were supervised by the mayor of Thebes, Ineni, and maybe also by the high priest of Amun, Apuseneb, in the time of Hatshepsut, both being director of all offices of the domain of Amun. And this has been published in the journal of the Museo Egizio, the Rivista, by Catherine Gabler and Daniel Soliman. One also has to recall here that the painter Maya, owner of TT 338, which you have here, in the cemetery of the el-Medina, presented himself as a painter of Amun in the place of Ma'at, just like many of his successors in the early Ramesside institution of the tomb. So in the end, the suggestion made by John Römer that the Theban elite tomb making and the work of the el-Medina crew in the royal necropolis were both supervised by the same authority could nevertheless in the end be correct, at least for most of the history of this community, even if this single authority was almost certainly situated on the east rather than on the west bank of the Nile. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you want to read more about this, this study has been recently published in the proceedings of the last Theban workshop. You have the reference on the screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dimitri. By the way, I was so interested in looking at this 18th dynasty background, especially for the errors and the limits, because actually in the Great Goods of Ka, we have the exactly similar phenomenon with miswritings, change of direction, and even in the, for instance, in the wooden box, sometimes in the check patterns, we have some errors in just following a diagonal line. So the painters just mistook in continuing this pattern, and actually it was a little bit surprising sometimes, but now I started to understand that probably it's part of this situation you are perfectly describing. So thank you so much, by the way, for such inspiration lecture. So, posso chiedervi intanto, lo dico in italiano, se ci sono delle domande, fatele pure in italiano, possiamo naturalmente tradurle poi per il professor Laboury. Ci sono intanto delle domande? Che se no io passo intanto a coloro che hanno seguito anche online. We have some questions from online, but I have to do like this. Okay. Just a curiosity. I would like to ask you if there was a sort of a prayer or rite for the painters before starting to decorate a tomb.
If there was?
It's a curiosity of a viewer from YouTube. So I would like to ask if there was a sort of a prayer or rite for the painters before starting to decorate a tomb. So he's just wondering if there was some documents or some elements as connecting the practice with a ritual. I mean,
no, as far as I know, there was no ritual aspect of this kind. No, or at least it's not attested.
Not attested
in our sources. Yeah.
Okay. No, this is, I guess, there are more compliments from YouTube viewers, but this is the only real question. There's a room for few questions about. C'è ancora spazio per qualche domanda?
Good evening, Dimitri, and thank you very much for your amazing lecture. Just a curiosity, I think you were not touching this topic, and I don't know if you have any news, just for me as a curiosity. Is there any evidence of female craftsmanship in el-Medina or in the 18th dynasty, as far as you know? In Thebes, in el-Medina, anywhere in let's say in Egypt?
Some evidence of what? I didn't get...
Female craftsmanship.
Female, no.
Maybe I was thinking about el-Medina, where the community was, let's say, very compact. So if we may have some evidence of.
That's a very interesting question. So I strove to find some evidence for a recent synthesis I published with one of my former PhD students on artists in ancient Egypt. I thought I had one case from Hierakonpolis. So if you look in the repertoire of the Urkundenvier, the classifiers of reference to artists, it seems that you have men and women. But thanks to Vivian Davis, I had a picture, and it's a mistake by the epigraphist. So we don't have a single evidence of professional female artists in ancient Egypt. This doesn't mean that women could not paint, for example, because we have two painters' palettes from two princesses of the Amarna royal family, which are kept in the Metropolitan Museum and a museum in Cairo, which shows that for princes and princesses, it seems that it was part of the education to be trained in arts and to paint in color. So I think that there were some ladies who could paint, and I said ladies because it was probably in the upper part of the society, and mainly, at least in this case, it's the royal circle, the royal family, but not on a professional level, which is quite consistent with, I would say, the statistic in pre-industrial societies, although in more recent artistry there are many female artists, but statistically there are much lesser in numbers than male artists, of course. But thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for your answer.
There's another question from YouTube. Even though we have just a few tombs documented or that we can appreciate in terms of style schemes and so, during the 18th dynasty, there's a chance to understand that maybe we have a sort of evolution in the quality even though we have few scattered elements to be studied.
An evolution of quality in el-Medina, you mean?
Yeah,
Yes,
the tombs
yes.
from the el-Medina, sure. Yeah.
So my reading of the situation is that these people were not trained to do that kind of things, but since they were more and more there on a regular basis, they try to develop new skills, and they try, thanks to people like this Senefer of TT 340, they try to go beyond the limit of what they've been trained to, and gradually they started to become more and more versatile in their production. And then there's a big turn when they are settled on a permanent basis in the el-Medina, and then you can see that there is textual production, and the level, the educational level really grow up increasingly and impressively with this settlement of the community. So it's very interesting. If they move, they don't have the time to develop other skills that what they were trained for. If they can stay there, they have more free time, so they can develop their own capabilities. Interesting to think of.
Hi, I have a question about, let's say, the number of artists and painters attached to the Amun temple, let's say. I'm interested in the, let's say, demographic. So how many people, painters, do you think were for each generation attached to the Amun temple? So about how many people, let's say, are we talking? Do you have any idea about, let's say, this?
So I was about to answer, I have no idea. So we don't have numbers. We know that there are, so we know from prosopographic evidence that there are chief, masters and so on, so there's a hierarchy, which means that there's a group. You cannot be the chief if you are 5 people, of course it means nothing. From what they made those people, it's very clear to me that Pharaoh needed to have an army of artists at hand to produce those monuments. It's another rule in general art history. The number of people involved in the making of a product, of a work, depends on the size of the work. So it's no surprise, of course, that Lady Liberty was made with a huge team, although there's a mastermind behind. There's August Bartholdi, who was the designer of this famous statue. So I think it was the same in ancient Egypt. You had chiefs, or emir, zeshuked, or that kind of people in the temple of Amun, who were responsible of the design of the decoration of a specific monument or room or whatever. And then you had to launch the army when the design was put on the walls to cut the stone and then to paint. And when you look at that kind of things, you can see that the painters sometimes they are just paintbrush handlers. So in some cases they go beyond the limit, they just don't care. And sometimes they ruin the work made by the designer, the initial designer. So you can really see different levels in royal productions. It's actually, this hierarchy of capabilities is more easy to detect with group production like royal production, and is less evident in private production, because for private owners they try to pick the best, so they pick the best in the top of the pyramid of the hierarchy, to have someone who's more versatile. Like the Pope wanted to have Raphael Sanzio to work for him and not many painters, because he could do everything with his own workshop. But Raphael made the design, and then it was the workshop to produce, to make it real. And it must have been the same, because it's some sort of ergonomic rule in art history. This being said, also, I'm sure that the number of artists varied according to time. So, as we discussed yesterday, I think in the time of Amenhotep III, they must have trained armies of artists, because he wanted to have hundreds of statues like your Sekhmets, and so for the craziness of his project, he needed to train a lot, generations of new artists. So according to the periods, the number of artists might have varied a lot, I think. But we don't have hard evidence to propose numbers, I'm afraid. Sorry.
So,
Yes,
but building on what you just said, actually, because that was one. So, could we envisage the possibility that in the let's say in the mid 18th dynasty, the master designers whose work was potentially ruined by the sloppy workmen who stepped in, who came after, were based in Karnak, whereas the workforce of Deir and Medina were doing the more basic work. If you see what I mean.
Yes. If you consider the evolution of the types of tombs in the Valley of the Kings, I think in the Ramesside period you need very good artists for many things because it's highly figurative. In the 18th dynasty, it's more it's more about excavating correctly a tomb, so it's an architectural project. And then if you have one or two good painters who can come and write and decorate like a papyrus, you can get them from Karnak or even Deir al-Bahari, because when I say Karnak, I mean it's the Amun estate, and the Amun estate is larger than Karnak, as you know, and I think they were based officially in Karnak, but probably they were working here and there according to the needs of the crown in the Theban area. But they are, I think, to be thought, and they were connected with the Per Amun, the domain of Amun, which was based officially in Karnak. But to get back to what I just said, in the 18th dynasty or in the Thutmose period, you don't need so many artists to produce those tombs. And what is at stake is to have a perfect architectural project. So I think most of them, they were excellent stone cutters, excavators, and so on. This is what they needed, and some of them only were painters. But they were trained to do very specific things. And when you look at TT 340, for example, he really wanted to do the best he could for his father. And from a general art historical point of view, when you consider ancient Egyptian art, this is not the best that ancient Egyptian art has produced. So clearly he ventured out of his comfort zone. So this shows the limits. But I think it's because they were trained for something else.
Right, and so to latch again onto what you just said, TT 340, what I saw there is the one technical shortcoming I seem to perceive there is lack of mastery of the grid. The bust was too long in relationship to the legs, and in general it seems like that was an important part of what a good Egyptian painter had to learn, was how to proportion figure based on a grid. I'm just wondering if that is part of it.
Yes, but he was clearly a professional painter because the painting itself is perfectly made from a technical point of view. So he knows how to create the painting with the binders and so on, how to handle a brush, but he didn't know how to do that kind of motifs. And we could think as Egyptologists, modern Egyptologists, okay, come on, to use a grid, it's so easy. We did it when we were in first grade schools and so on, so why can't they do this? Is really stupid. But it's not the case. You have to know the keys, and it's the same for the ceiling patterns here. To make the patterns on the ceiling, it's very easy if you know the keys. If you don't know them, then you come out with that messed up fabric pattern, and it shows that it's not so. You need to know the key, so it's a matter of training. If you were not trained to do that kind of things, then you're done, more or less.
Just one last curiosity, also seeing this. No, that will be my last one. Does the painter of TT 354, with the ceiling pattern, does he imitate another ceiling pattern close by or somewhere else? Or is this his own, let's say, invention?
I think so. I think it's an invention derived from what you can find in coeval elite tombs. So probably because it was nearby, they went to visit elite tombs, because we can also demonstrate that artists in ancient Egypt, like any artist, they traveled and visited the works of their colleagues to find some inspiration or to mock what they have done and that kind of things. So probably he went to an elite tomb and he thought, oh wow, it looks really great. It's like probably being in a tent. It probably imitated real tents in ancient Egypt. So he wanted to do it, but he just captured visually the motif but didn't know how to do it. And again, it's very easy. You have patterns, but if you don't have the keys, you cannot do it on your own.
Thanks.
Okay, so is there any question more? I guess. Okay. Dimitri, thank you so much for your
It's really
lecture.
my pleasure. Thank you.